Colombia says the incentive program is paying off. Other places say it hasn't really been the case for them. Several studies in the U.S. and Canada have found that for every dollar of tax incentives, only about 10 to 20 cents of economic activity is generated. So what does this all mean? Joseph Chianese has guided movie studios through these incentive programs. He's Executive Vice President at Entertainment Partners. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.
How important are these programs to production companies?
They're critical. I mean, in the U.S. alone, these incentives have been around close to 15 years, but even before the U.S., places like Canada, UK, Australia are all offering incentives. So as producers in the U.S., you really have close to 40 U.S. states and close to 40 international jurisdictions to choose from. And that really is an important part of their budget. And most films aren't greenlit today without either a production incentive being included or very seriously considered.
I want to read you something on this topic from the Los Angeles Daily News. It reported last year the competition for Hollywood's cash has become more and more frenzied in recent years as states and foreign countries increasingly try to outbid each other with tax incentives. It's become a race, some say, to the bottom. Now 42 states and more than 30 foreign countries offer them. You mentioned this. But from the country's perspective, from a government perspective, are these programs really worth it for them?
I think so. I mean, I'm not an economist, but if you look at, as I mentioned before, the number of states and the number of countries that are offering these, they're doing it for a reason. And I know you mentioned before economic impact reports that mentioned that the return on investment didn't show that they paid off. But most of those reports really were comparing apples to apples, meaning they were comparing tax credits that were being given out to taxes that were being generated by salaries in the states and countries. But there are other components economically that weren't factored into most of those studies, meaning every time a dollar gets spent somewhere, it's typically spent over and over again, sometimes close to 15 times. And that money goes to paying people's mortgages and other things. And those are the intangible economic factors that usually aren't included in those economic impact reports.
Joseph, earlier in your career, you oversaw all tax matters for Sony Pictures Entertainment, and before that, you did similar work for the Walt Disney Company. How complicated is it to not only find these programs, but to also qualify for them?
Well, the qualification piece is relatively easy, especially as these programs become more normalized. I mean, the aspects to qualifying isn't difficult. The tricky part is staying on top of the legislation. These rules change a lot, and that's what probably keeps me the busiest, is staying on top of the legislative changes. Anytime I advise a producer today, when they're looking at an incentive, I tell them you want certainty. You want certainty in the law, you want certainty in the process, and certainty in the funding. And to sort of work backwards, a lot of jurisdictions have only a certain amount of money available each year. You mentioned that as related to Colombia. So when you're going to a jurisdiction, one, you want to make sure the money is there. Two, you want to make sure that there's a process that works. And three, that the legislation isn't going to change on you. That's probably the three most important elements when you're considering any incentive, whether it's here in the U.S. or internationally.
Right, because they obviously can't accept everybody. You know, it's one thing for a movie studio from Hollywood to shoot a movie in a country like Colombia, but it's another for Colombia to start its own movie industry. So does starting these tax incentive programs help kickstart domestic production?
Well, for Colombia, I'm pretty familiar with what was going on in Colombia. Colombia is actually very well known for its own film and television industry. What they were hoping to do is attract the foreign producers. And one of the reasons why the Colombia incentive is going so well is there's a lot of pre-existing infrastructure in Colombia, not only qualified crew, but stages. So when a producer is considering an incentive, they actually will run a budget, usually multiple budgets. They'll look at multiple jurisdictions when they're considering a film. Most of these jurisdictions have an incentive attached, but then they also have to consider, is there existing crew? Is there existing infrastructure? Because if there isn't, then you have to bring crew. If you're traveling or bringing crew anywhere, that's an additional cost that takes away from the benefit. So with regards to Colombia, they had that crew, they had that infrastructure, which just added to the benefit when the incentive was added on top of that.